After the fall of Manila, the Japanese swiftly began pushing southward, even before the Philippine campaign had concluded. They initially landed at Rabaul on New Britain and at Cavite on New Ireland just 3 weeks after capturing Manila. From Rabaul, they launched 2 major offensives. One headed into New Guinea from the southwest and another moving across the Solomon Islands from the southeast. These movements were part of a broader strategy aimed at either conquering or cutting off Australia from Allied support. New Guinea, spanning over 1,500 miles from northwest to southeast and encompassing more than 300,000 square miles, ranks among the largest, least explored, and least developed islands in the world. Its geographical position made it a vital barrier to any northern approach toward Australia. The island's interior, dominated by thick jungles and rugged mountain ranges, posed significant obstacles to Japanese advancement, often preventing them from reaching the southern coastline. In early March 1942, the Japanese landed on New Guinea and set up bases at Lae and Salamaua, located in the Huon Gulf. These outposts were crucial for launching further offensives along the Papuan coast. Their progress was so alarming that Australian military planners seriously contemplated the possibility of abandoning most of Queensland, Australia's northern province, and falling back to a defensive line just north of Brisbane. The Japanese momentum was temporarily interrupted by a crucial naval engagement that occurred around the same time as the fall of Corregidor on May 6th. This battle, known as the Battle of the Coral Sea, marked a significant moment in military history, as it was the first major naval conflict fought entirely by aircraft launched from carriers. The confrontation unfolded between May 4th and May 8th in the seas southeast of New Guinea. Although both sides suffered losses, including the American carrier Lexington and damage to the Yorktown, the Japanese were compelled to retreat after losing a carrier and sustaining damage to other ships. This marked the first time in the Pacific War that the Japanese had been dealt a substantial setback. However, the advance wasn't completely stopped, just momentarily stalled. Following this, the Japanese shifted their strategy and began an overland campaign through the Owen Stanley Mountains along the Kokoda Trail, aiming to capture Port Moresby, the final major Allied stronghold north of Australia. On July 21st and 22nd, Japanese forces landed at Gona, Buna, and Sanananda on New Guinea's northern coast. They advanced dangerously close, within 32 miles, of Port Moresby. Their progress was eventually halted. Meanwhile, the Japanese made another landing near Milne Bay, at the southeastern tip of New Guinea. This move suggested they were preparing for a seaborne assault on Port Moresby. However, after 3 days of intense fighting, Japanese destroyers were forced to evacuate 2 Australian brigades that had mounted an effective counterattack. In early September, Japanese warships returned to shell the area, but on September 11th, an American destroyer group under Captain Cornelius W. Flynn moved north to intercept Japanese forces, though none were located. This marked the last time Japan attempted to reinsert forces into Milne Bay. At the same time, Japan was pouring massive amounts of resources, naval, air, and ground troops, into the fierce and pivotal battle for Guadalcanal. This diversion of their forces contributed to their waning efforts in New Guinea. With the arrival of U.S. ground forces in the Southwest Pacific and the shift of Japanese attention to Guadalcanal, Allied troops from the United States and Australia concentrated on expelling Japanese forces from eastern New Guinea. They mounted a 2-pronged counteroffensive, pushing back Japanese troops along the Kokoda Trail and simultaneously launching a coastal advance toward Buna. After a prolonged and brutal fight, where harsh weather, swamps, and jungles proved as deadly as the enemy, Allied forces captured Buna Mission on January 2nd. By January 23rd, they had cleared the remaining Japanese positions in Sanananda. Naval support played a key role in the coastal campaign. Patrol torpedo boats, known as PT boats, were the first naval vessels to actively engage Japanese forces in New Guinea's coastal waters. To prepare for this, the first PT boats were transported from Pearl Harbor to New Guinea. On July 5, 1942, the tender ship Hilo and its crew welcomed PT boats 21, 23, 25, and 26, collectively forming Motor Torpedo Boat Division 2 of Squadron 1 under the command of Lieutenant Jonathan F. Rice of the U.S. Naval Reserve. 10 days later, Hilo departed Pearl Harbor and headed 1,100 miles southwest to Palmyra Island. 2 PT boats were towed by the Hilo, while the other 2 sailed independently, refueling each morning en route. The vessels rotated towing duties midway through the journey, so each crew experienced the challenges equally. Life at Palmyra Island was uneventful, with little to do but run practice drills and serve as mock targets for the radar station. The PT crews were eager for action. In mid-September, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz passed through Palmyra en route to Guadalcanal. After addressing the officers stationed there, Lieutenant Junior Grade Elvin Cluster managed to persuade the Admiral that the boats would be better utilized farther south. Nimitz agreed and dispatched orders to redeploy the boats, also approving minor upgrades such as dry docking and radar installation. After a quick return trip to Pearl Harbor for these upgrades, Hilo and the PT boats headed back to Palmyra and then departed on October 25th, ultimately reaching their new base at Funafuti in the Ellis Islands on November 2nd. As they departed, they were alert for signs of Captain Eddie Rickenbacker's aircraft, which had gone missing over the Pacific on a special mission for the War Department. His pilot had radioed on October 21st that they were lost and low on fuel. On November 11th, after an afternoon patrol, Lieutenant Junior Grade Frederick E. Woodward, flying a Navy Kingfisher scout plane based at Funafuti, spotted a yellow life raft a few miles south of the atoll. This was the first sign of Rickenbacker's crew. Lieutenant Cluster promptly launched PT-21, which successfully rescued a seriously ill man and brought him aboard Hilo. After receiving medical treatment from Lieutenant Richard W. Giddy, Hilo's medical officer, the man identified himself as Captain William T. Cherry, Jr., the pilot of Rickenbacker's aircraft. The remaining survivors were believed to be in 2 other rafts drifting southwest of the initial rescue location. 2 days before the rescue, the survivors had split up, making their recovery even more complicated. At first light on the 12th, Lieutenant Commander Monroe got the ship Hilo and the 4 patrol torpedo boats PTs underway after hearing that another life raft had been seen northwest of the island by a Kingfisher scout plane. The aircraft had landed near the raft in hopes of helping the men aboard. Monroe received this report around 4:30 p.m., and the PT boats set off at full speed to assist, just as daylight was beginning to fade. In one of the PT boats, PT-26, Lieutenant J.M. Weeks of the U.S. Naval Reserve managed to locate the aircraft. Although the Kingfisher was a small 2-seat plane and already at full capacity, the pilot, Lieutenant William F. Eddy, felt the urgency of the moment. Concerned that the approaching darkness might prevent the PT boats from finding the raft, he made the brave decision to land and take on 3 survivors. Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, his assistant Colonel Adamson, and Private John F. Bartek, the flight engineer, were all taken aboard. Colonel Adamson, suffering from a severe back injury, was carefully placed in the rear of the aircraft with the radio operator, while the others were secured to the plane's wings, Rickenbacker on one side and Bartek on the other. As the Kingfisher began to taxi 40 miles back to base at Funafuti, PT-26 arrived on the scene. Rickenbacker and Bartek were transferred to the PT boat, but due to Adamson's condition, it was safer for the aircraft to continue to base by water rather than risk moving him again. Lieutenant Edward M. Garden, executive officer of the Hilo, later noted how remarkable it was that despite being stranded at sea for 21 days, Captain Eddie Rickenbacker still asked to be shown around the PT boat, curious because he had never seen one before. The following morning, once Hilo anchored at Funafuti, Lieutenant Carl J. Franklin of the U.S. Marine Corps came aboard with more news. A 3rd raft, containing 3 additional survivors, had drifted ashore at Nuku Fetau, about 60 miles northwest, according to a local coast watcher. Monroe set out immediately and arrived near the island in the afternoon. The lagoon waters were too murky to risk taking Hilo in, so a whaleboat was sent instead with Garden and the ship's doctor, Lieutenant Richard Guinea. They returned about an hour later with the 3 survivors, Staff Sergeant J.W. Reynolds, Lieutenant J.J. DeAngelis, and Lieutenant J.C. Whitaker, the co-pilot. Whitaker was in fairly decent health, but the other 2 were in terrible condition, severely malnourished and suffering from open sores. Monroe was surprised to find that the oldest members of the group, Rickenbacker and Whitaker, had fared the best. Upon their return, Garden and Guinea shared a surprising and humorous story of encountering a beautiful native woman who spoke perfect English, offered them drinks, and invited them to stay the night. DeAngelis and Whitaker were sent to a hospital for care, but Reynolds was so weak he had to remain aboard the Hilo while Dr. Guinea administered glucose and plasma. The ship stayed at sea overnight and returned to Funafuti the next day. The Marines and construction battalions at the base were generous and helpful, providing whatever little they could from their limited supplies. Monroe unloaded all spare engines, torpedoes, and parts for the Packard and Elko boats. On November 24th, a dispatch from Copac ordered Monroe to proceed to Noumea, leaving the 4 PT boats behind at Funafuti. The situation for the boats was bleak. They had no pier, no gasoline in bulk, no torpedo compressor, no repair dock, no workshop, no facilities for eating or sleeping, and fresh water had to be delivered in gas drums. Hilo left the next day and arrived in Noumea by December 2nd. Division 17, consisting of PTs 113 and 114 from Squadron 2 and PTs 119 to 122 from Squadron 6, was now under the command of Lieutenant Daniel S. Bauman II, who had formerly served as the executive officer of Squadron 6. Monroe was directed to transport the Hilo and 4 boats of Division 17 to Cairns, Australia, and report for duty to the Southwest Pacific Forces. Upon arrival, Monroe learned that PTs 121 and 122 had already departed for Cairns a few days earlier, towed by a Liberty ship carrying a large portion of the division's spare parts. Hilo refueled and joined another Liberty ship to collect the remaining supplies. However, a barge carrying many essential Packard parts had capsized the day before, resulting in significant loss. Despite the confusion and urgency, loading was completed, and a small base force boarded Hilo. The ship and its 4 boats departed Noumea late in the afternoon on December 3rd. 2 of the boats were under tow, and the convoy moved at a slow 5-knot pace. They had an escort this time, the USS Aaron Ward. The weather during the journey was harsh. Poor visibility and frequent squalls made navigation extremely difficult. None of the PT boat crews had been to sea before, and station keeping was a major challenge. One particularly stormy night, one of the boats kept disappearing from sight. The quartermaster was inexperienced and couldn't read the signal blinker. It took 3 hours to get a visual message across, instructing the boat to come within hailing distance, and another hour for it to actually do so. When the boat finally drew alongside, Monroe sternly ordered the captain to stay within 200 yards of Hilo. No exceptions. Later, during a meeting in Cairns to plan the next stage of operations, the same boat captain, whose name Monroe chose not to mention, voiced his disapproval of Monroe's tone during that megaphone exchange. Despite such frictions, the voyage was completed. Monroe reflected that in the 7 days at sea, he had only managed to get 21 hours of sleep. Between broken tow lines and engine failures, the trip had been grueling. Thankfully, the captain of the escorting destroyer had sent several encouraging messages along the way, helping to maintain morale during the difficult crossing. On the morning of December 11th, the ship Hilo and the patrol torpedo boats arrived in Cairns. Just a day later, they received new orders instructing them to proceed directly to Milne Bay and report to the commander of Task Group 50.1, which was designated as the PT Boat Task Group operating in New Guinea. A few days earlier, two PT boats, numbers 121 and 122, had already departed from Milne Bay alongside the gunboat Tulsa. The advance unit of PT Base 4 had also reached Cairns by that time. Lieutenant Commander Monroe described a state of confusion dominating Cairns. Their first notable interaction was with the Australian destroyer HMAS Arunta, which had a rather shabby-looking captain, Calder, and a strong tradition of wine consumption aboard. The selected site for establishing a base turned out to be in a swamp filled with mangroves, and it lacked even basic construction equipment. Much of the squadron's essential gear, which had arrived earlier with the first two PT boats, had been stored in a public warehouse, but had already been looted. Despite this setback, the team managed to gather as much usable equipment as possible, including an advanced communications unit led by Ensign Simons. Each man was given a Red Cross package and a single bottle of Australian beer. Spending an evening aboard the Arunta proved to be a nerve-wracking experience. Late on December 15th, they departed Cairns and met their escort, the USS Patterson, just outside the harbor. This ship was commanded by Lieutenant Commander Schultz, a former classmate. Each of the PT boats operated on their own, refueling on the 16th due to the relatively short travel distance and the potential threat of enemy air attacks. The weather remained unpleasant, and Schultz made several sarcastic remarks about the conditions, humorously comparing them to a helpless hen unable to care for her chicks. By the morning of the 17th, they had sighted the New Guinea coastline and confirmed their position. At that point, Schultz informed them that his orders did not permit him to go any further, and he turned back, leaving the group feeling quite alone. From then until the arrival of the ship Riel in late May, the only other American naval vessels they encountered were the Tulsa and occasional smaller support craft. Although Milne Bay offered several good anchorage options for the high-low, its location was already behind the advancing front lines, making it an impractical choice for a PT boat operating base. Buna was only about 15 miles away and still under heavy ground combat. Since soldiers had already pushed about 200 kilometers up the coast, the PTs needed to establish a base further along the coastline. 2 days earlier, PTs 121 and 122 had been sent to Porlock Harbor, located on the western edge of the Cape Nelson Peninsula, to lay the groundwork for an advanced base. On the night of December 18th, the two boats went on their first patrol in New Guinea waters. They spotted what they believed to be a surfaced enemy submarine and fired 2 torpedoes. While the torpedoes failed to explode, the boat commanders believed they had hit their target. However, it was soon clear that Porlock Harbor was not suitable for use. The water was too shallow for even modest supply ships to unload fuel drums, and the land was swampy with no space to disperse the boats. Gasoline could only be offloaded by dumping fuel drums overboard and having crew members swim them ashore. On December 18th, Calder, accompanied by 2 PT boats and Commander Edgar T. Neal of Task Group 50.1, left Milne Bay in search of a better location in the Cape Nelson region. The following day, on the eastern side of Cape Nelson, they found Tufi. This inlet, resembling a fjord, was deep and narrow, winding between steep hills. There was a small flat space at the base of a hill where a gasoline dump and dock could be constructed. Boats could anchor farther up the inlet, hidden from enemy aircraft. A clear stream flowed into the inlet, and Tufi already hosted a small government outpost with an Australian representative who was able to recruit local labor for heavy work like moving fuel drums. Shortly after abandoning Porlock Harbor, the vessels relocated to Tufi. The Tulsa soon brought in the mobile communications unit and a supply of base equipment. On the night of December 23rd and into the 24th, a patrol reported sighting what they believed was another enemy submarine. Lieutenant Bowman was patrolling the coast with PT-122 under the command of Ensign Robert F. Lynch. On Christmas Eve, about 15 miles past Buna, near the Kumi River, they encountered a large surfaced submarine and what seemed to be another close by. Lynch set up the torpedo director and fired 2 aft torpedoes from about 1,000 yards, while Theodore F. Bruno maneuvered the boat in closer. Though there was a flare and a splash, the submarine didn't go down immediately. Bruno moved closer by 500 more yards, and Lynch launched 2 forward torpedoes. A second, stronger explosion followed, and the submarine was seen splitting in 2 and sinking, engulfed in flames. PT-122 was credited with sinking the 2,180-ton Japanese submarine E-22 after the war, although later research cast doubt on whether that was truly the vessel they had destroyed. About 10 minutes after the sinking, the crew had to dodge 4 incoming torpedoes, likely launched by a second submarine attempting to retaliate. That same night, New Guinea saw its first PT boat engagement against Japanese landing craft when PT-114 and 121 intercepted and sank 2 troop transports at Douglas Harbor. The enemy responded with small arms fire, but the American boats suffered no casualties or damage. Commander Neal described the chaotic skirmish as resembling a disorganized brawl more than a strategic naval engagement. By early January, it became evident that Buna would soon fall. Intelligence reports on January 6th indicated that a Japanese convoy of 2 cruisers, 4 destroyers, and 4 merchant ships was heading to Buna from Gasmata. The boats were prepared to intercept, but the threat never materialized. Later, they learned that American airstrikes had damaged the convoy, causing it to retreat. On the evening of January 17th, PT-120 encountered 3 enemy barges near Douglas Harbor, carrying Japanese Army officials. The boat attacked under intense enemy fire and successfully sank 2 of the barges, while setting the 3rd on fire. During the battle, crewman John J. Masters, Jr. was mortally wounded. Despite his injury, he remained at his post, only asking for assistance once he could no longer function. Even in his final moments, he used his remaining strength to instruct an inexperienced crewmate to take over. He was posthumously awarded the Silver Star for his bravery and critical role in the mission's success. As in the Philippines, the PT boats in New Guinea often had to patrol solo due to a lack of available boats and the poor state of repair facilities. By February 1st, PTs 113 and 122 were so severely damaged from coral reefs that they had to be hauled back to Cairns for rebuilding. That left only 4 PT boats still in active service. However, unlike the situation in the Philippines in 1942, New Guinea in 1943 had better supply lines and reinforcements were already on their way.